Hi, everyone. Hello. Hi. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Anna Katz. I am the Wendy Stark Curatorial Fellow here at MOCA, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here today. Today's program is part of a newly launched series at MOCA that we're calling What is Contemporary? And this afternoon, it puts Hito Steyerl in conversation with Lanka Tattersall. In just a few more weeks, under this aegis of this same series, What is Contemporary?, the painter Laura Owens and the critic and historian Suzanne Hudson will be in this very room. That's Thursday, March 3rd at 7 p.m., and we'll hope you'll join us for that as well. So, Hito Steyerl is a filmmaker and writer based in Berlin, where she teaches new media art at Berlin University of the Arts. In both of her primary disciplines, image making and writing, Steyerl operates as a cultural critic. She's incisively diagnosed a newly emergent sensibility of the endless proliferation of increasingly networked and algorithmically, was that right? Algorithmically produced digital images. She's articulated the stakes for artists working today. She's argued, for example, that within a fully immersive media landscape in which people are constantly being monitored, recorded, identified, photographed, scanned, taped, that in this fully immersive media landscape, pictorial representation, which was once seen as a prerogative and a political privilege, she tells us now pictorial representation feels more like a threat. This is what she asserts in The Spam of the Earth, Withdrawal from Representation, an essay published in Efflux Journal in 2012, a piece of writing from which I've learned a lot, and I suspect a few of you in here have as well. She tells us that we're being represented to pieces. She's referring to social media and cell phone cameras, mutual mass surveillance, she describes them. Urban networks of control like CCTV, cell phone, GPS tracking, face recognition software, referring to Warhol's prediction that everybody would be world famous for 15 minutes in the future. She says that many people are actually in pursuit of its opposite today, to be invisible, if only for 15 minutes. She also writes, even 15 seconds would be great. So this is a bitter pill to swallow for those of us who have long invested in the premise that one good reason to be interested in art is that representation is a kind of shared term between aesthetics and politics, that representation is an arena of contestation mutually shared by art and politics. Steyerl cautions that this faithful link on which so many of us, again, have built our thinking, that this faithful link between art and politics is especially unstable today. Visual representation has shifted into overdrive and has been popularized through digital technologies, while political representation of the people has slipped into a deep crisis and is overshadowed by economic interests. In essays like the one that I'm butchering now, Steyerl changes how we think about images. A growing number of unmoored and floating images correspond to a growing number of disenfranchised, invisible, even disappeared and missing people, she teaches us. She's changing how we think about art and politics and about the relationship between the two in an age of unrepresentable people and an overpopulation of images. Joining Hito Steyerl today is Lanka Tattersall. Lanka is assistant curator at MOCA and the curator of Hito Steyerl, Factory of the Sun, an immersive video installation which has just opened. Factory of the Sun debuted at the 2015 Venice Biennale, and its exhibition here at MOCA represents its US premiere. So we're all rather thrilled that Lanka's curatorial vision saw a place for this piece here at MOCA. And it's on view here at MOCA Grand Avenue, just one floor above us, till September 12th.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everyone, for being here. Thank you. Oops.
So the kind of broad framework for this conversation is what is contemporary, and wireless microphones are definitely contemporary. And since we have the exhibition that's just opened today, Factory of the Sun, I thought it might be good to actually just start with the work that we just watched a clip from and the work that's upstairs. Factory of the Sun brings together a kind of remarkable constellation of ideas involving labor, surveillance, the pleasures of dance, protest movements, the idea of a collective body, the idea of identity as mutable, the transmission of streams of data, and the techniques of motion capture studios. And there are other topics that are in this work. And I'm just curious to know about the sort of seeds of the project, how you started to kind of research, gather materials, begin to kind of conceive of what this project could be?
Well, at least 3 different things came together at the beginning of trying to structure this work. First of all, this quote by Donna Haraway, which starts off with saying, "Our machines are made of pure sunlight." And then she keeps on talking about how light is not only coding everything, every kind of information, but also human pain. And I thought that was remarkable. I really wanted to do something around that. Then there was a second anecdote, which I thought was really funny. I was researching high-frequency trading and how that works, and right at this time, and of course it's all based around speed, right? Having a faster connection will enable you to trade more efficiently. And at this time, there was news about an experiment at CERN in Geneva where people said they had measured a particle flying at a speed that was faster than the speed of light. And all the traders were extremely excited about that, right? Of course, it turned out that it never worked. There was a cable that was kind of loose. And superluminal speed never happened. But anyway, so I thought that was hilarious. I have to try to do something about that. And then third of all, it's always somehow about the protagonists in my work. The girl, Julia, the protagonist, she was working for me previously. She was doing 3D models, basically, for my exhibitions, and she told me about her brother, TSC, who's the dancer in the work, who's a real-life YouTube star, and I started watching his clips, and I never stopped. And then somehow, all these 3 things started getting meshed up with one another, so this is how the work started.
So, I mean, one thing that the first time I saw the work installed in the Venice Biennial was kind of a cold viewing, like first, uninformed viewing of it. And as I've learned more about the work, and I learned the way in which the biography of Julia is actually her biography, and also of Take Some Crime, TSC, her brother. And I guess the question for me would be, why do you have this interest in working with what's the interest in the biographical?
Well, I mean, in this case, but in many other cases as well, the real biographies are so much more interesting than anything I could imagine, right? I'm just not good enough to imagine such strong and interesting biographies.
Is there also, I mean, there's this moment in the clip that we just saw where she lines the gun to realism mode, and I know that you've written frequently about the idea about realism, and I guess, could you say a little bit more about what realism means to you?
Well, I mean, this mode really exists in the game we're quoting here. So the realism mode actually looks kind of similar, and it's really difficult to pull off because there's so many different layers of blurs and stuff going on in After Effects, so it's not realism at all, right? But this is always the case with realism. Realism is always far from, you know, being, I mean, what is realism? How is it coded? So now realism apparently looks like that. It's kind of interesting.
You also, we were talking about the different kinds of the CGI, the coding that happens, and there was, you mentioned that, you know, this head of Stalin was actually something that you had found on the internet, and I don't know if you could explain that story. Yeah.
It's online. It costs €1. You know, like acquiring Stalin is not a problem, but shattering Stalin, that's really tough, you know, because you have to pre-shatter him first, basically model all the lines where he's supposed to break and explode, and then you can basically shoot him and then he will explode, I mean, break off in all those different parts. So we had a specific person to do the Stalin shatter. It's a credit.
Easy to acquire, difficult to break. Interesting. Yeah. So I know not everyone here will have had a chance to see the installation upstairs, though this image, which is from, this is the Venice installation, gives you a sense of how it's installed. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the decisions you made in terms of the installation, which is very specific.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, the work was made for a specific space, which is the German pavilion at the Venice Biennial, which is probably one of the most conflicted and convoluted and difficult and awful and inhospitable art spaces in the world, right? With all this fascist history, it's really cold. There's no heating. There's not even a bathroom, right? Fascists did not even take care of that. So, okay, so every 4 years, when some other person has to deal with it, so this was my turn this time, well, our turn. This was a group of several people. But I was really trying, everyone, every single one of us, everyone who's drafted to do something in this space, we were really trying to figure out how to deal with this space, right? How to deal with this kind of huge, cold hall. So in essence, the architecture, and you can't really see, it's very high, also tries to respond to the fact that this was built as a fascist, almost church-like structure to inspire awe, right? To overwhelm people. And this tries to basically update the situation of being overwhelmed by something into the age of, well, into the information age. What would it look like? So in that sense, the installation is rather specific. And there's one thing I want to mention because, you know, many people are mentioning Tron, the film Tron, 1982, I think, Disney production, is excellent work as a kind of precedent for this installation, which is not really the case. The real precedent is a Star Trek series where there is something called a holodeck on board. And the holodeck is an installation that materializes different worlds in 3D. So it's a sort of, you know, it's something that's able to materialize a different world. That's what we try to quote it here, the holodeck.
So to materialize a different world, and also a world that is, I guess, impossible, at least in a kind of tangible way, to create on our planet as it is at the moment. And
yeah, somehow it's about, you know, you need to even disable some laws of physics, you know, to be order to pull it off. But I think that's something really important nowadays. Yeah.
Which also, I guess, connects back to what you were saying about CERN and the idea of the acceleration of light and this kind of disembodiment, this articulation of solidity. And you know, later in the video installation, Take Some Crimes, his movement. I mean, actually, you could probably explain it about the anime fans.
Yeah, he has a lot of real-life fans, of course, and they use the so-called MMD technology. Do you know that? Where anyhow, it's about mapping motion capture data, which someone painstakingly recreated from watching his dance videos, and mapping it onto other avatars, which are prefabricated. They are from other anime series or, you know, manga figures, and they basically animated them using his movements. So one of his dances exists in at least 2-3 dozen different versions on the internet, and I used some of those as well. You know, the proliferation of his movement.
Mm-hmm. So these anime characters in the narrative, as I understand it, form this kind of political movement, but they're, you know, not. It's a disembodied kind of international political movement. And
well, the general idea is those anime figures you see in the film, or even those you have on your phone all the time, they are basically the stand-ins for people who are going to get killed in the future in protests. And they travel back into the past to appear as these kind of anime figures. Mm-hmm. I don't think anyone will understand that by seeing the film. So this is why I'm explaining it. I also have to say the film is really a mess. But it's okay.
So, I mean, the idea of the anime figures forming this kind of group in some way, you know, and the footage that you'll see in the video, it's actually, you were explaining to me, it's all found footage. It reminded me, there's this text that you wrote in 2002 where you ask, I mean, it's sort of it seems like a straightforward question, but the question, it's from your text, The Articulation of Protest, and you ask, what is the image of a protest movement? And so when I see that footage, I think, is that a kind of idea of a model, even if it's a phantasmatic one? And so I guess I was curious how, maybe not even so tethered to Factory of the Sun, but I would be curious to know how you would answer that question today, if at all. You know, what is the image, or what are possible models for an image of a protest movement?
I don't know. No, not at all. You know, it's interesting because I wrote that text basically before even YouTube existed, right? It referred to the protests in Geneva and Seattle. So it's really been a long time ago. And of course, you know, any kind of representation of protest movements has changed so dramatically ever since, you know, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, so many protest movements have been engineered, catalyzed, or even also destroyed, you know, by social media in the meantime. So I think whatever I said at this point in time is definitely outdated now. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think there would even be a possibility for a kind of cohesion around an idea of an image of a protest movement?
I'm not so sure about that. Mm-hmm. Maybe that used to work, but I think right now it's more about the fact, you know, of some kind of information circulating through a network, but not even that, as we have seen, is enough to really sustain a protest movement. It may work to catalyze something, right? But then if this is not supported by people, I mean, just meeting physically in meet space, then it's not going to continue.
I mean, the question of meet space, which is just like, I think, an incredible way to talk about actual, like, this is meet space, the kind of ethics of actually being physically together in public space or non-public space, I think is in the kind of way in which, you know, the idea of the motion capture studio that's so central. There's this great part, you know, where it's like the workers are in the gulag, and there's this one line that's like, everyone's working, it's totally sunny, it's awful, you know? And so these different conditions of being together, but also being, that idea of visibility being somehow a source of control, I think it becomes very important in this work, and also in How Not to Be Seen, a fucking didactic.mov file. So I thought maybe we could show that as well, and maybe talk about that a bit.
We'll just show a small part of it, like a 4-minute extract. Where is it? Yeah. Here we go. So shall I say something? It's a manual, very short manual, like 15 minutes, on the question of how not to be seen, how to become invisible. And this is actually a quote from a sketch that the Monty Python's Flying Circus did in the 1970s. They did it much better, I have to say. But anyhow, I tried my best. So that's a 4-minute clip. No?
How not to be seen. Lesson 4.
Could we bring the lights down, please?
There are 13 ways of becoming invisible by disappearing. Living in a gated community. Living in a military zone. Being in an airport, factory or museum. Owning an anti-paparazzi handbag. Being fitted with an invisibility cloak. Being a superhero. Being female and over 50. Surfing the dark web. Being a dead pixel. Being a Wi-Fi signal moving through human bodies. Being undocumented or poor. Being spam caught by a filter. Being a disappeared person as an enemy of the state. Eliminated. Liquidated. And then dissimulated.
In the decades of the digital revolution, 170,000 people disappear. Disappeared people are annihilated, eliminated, eradicated, deleted, dispensed with, filtered, processed, selected, separated, wiped out. Invisible people retreat into 3D animations. They hold the vectors of the mesh and keep the picture together. They re-emerge as pixels. They merge into a world made of images.
And now I started, it became clear to me that basically, but it's been like that for quite a while, but I think now most, not only images, all kinds of information are mostly made for machines, by machines, and they are coded in a way that's inaccessible to humans altogether. No? So basically we live within this kind of chaos of signals, zipping by, which are absolutely inaccessible to human senses, so that basically most of everything that could potentially be visible is completely removed, no, from the reach of human senses. Mm-hmm. It's really interesting because eyes or ears are not able to sense most relevant things anymore, no?
And I think that's something that also comes up in Factory of the Sun very, very clearly, this idea of electromagnetic frequencies only having this very small bandwidth that actually is perceivable by humans. And so there's this funny way in which there's this contradiction between the light bulb, which is this motif that appears again and again, and the light bulb, of course, takes on this sense of a kind of obsolescence already in Factory of the Sun, and also seeing the How Not to Be Seen clip. Both of these really make me think about the role of contradiction in your work. So it's, it's like the soothing voice of capitalism, and then, absolute political urgencies around issues of life and death. And so, and the idea of contradiction, I think, also growing from a certain idea of montage, and I know you've talked about, written extensively about montage, but I just would be interested to hear you talk about contradiction, if that's something you even think about and how you approach that.
Oh yes, of course. I mean, I embrace it, let's put it like that, right? Because I think this is the form, this is a series about the contemporary, right? Contradiction is the form of the contemporary. I mean, everything consists of, everything is contradictory, no? And basically, if you, or if I am still committed to reality, then I'm constantly mired in contradiction, right? So there is two ways of dealing with it. Either you try to avoid it and steer clear of it, or you try to use it as a sort of force, right? Because there is, of course, a tension that can, catalyze things that used to be called dialectic, but somehow it doesn't work in that way anymore. But still, contradiction is, of course, powerful. No, there's a powerful charge congealed in there.
It's interesting that you said, dialectic doesn't work anymore, because as I was, typing out my questions, I had a question where I said dialectic, and I took it out, and I was like, that's not quite the right word. I mean, I think catalyze is right, or I mean, in a way, it's actually something...
One of the reasons why it doesn't work is that it departs from the idea that there's two opposites, but nowadays there's at least 5, no? So, yeah, there was this kind of metaphor given to me by a dear colleague. This is actually a work by Yoko Ono. It's a chess set, right? But all the pieces on there are white. But you're supposed to play the game. But who? Are you maybe, who are you? Who? And I think, on any kind of contemporary chess set, there's at least, there's zebras, there's batteries, there is dollar coins, they have, 20 different colors, and everyone is playing with them. No one knows the rules. So this is why the idea of two, camps facing one another is not really working today.
I think that's, also in terms of using the model of the video game, if we think of a usual video game as being structured around 2 antagonisms, or an idea of, passing through levels and then winning, I think the model of the video game in Factory of the Sun, it becomes totally expanded in a certain way. And I think both the motion capture studio and the video game, I'm curious about why you were interested in those as spaces for exploration in this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the motion capture studio is, I think, very, very clear and obvious allegory of the fact that basically any kind of motion or emotion is being captured, either for real or potentially. And that applies to basically any kind of activity, not only to what used to be called labor, just any. And so for me that's pretty obvious. And the idea of the game is precisely because I think that the mechanisms of games are so expanded now into real life that one really one should find out about how they work, just because everyday life is getting gamified to a large extent. Not only life, any kind of, extended surveillance system, be it, consumer monitoring, or the cataloging of any kind of preference you have. All of that is being registered in a way that resembles a game, and in many cases is sort of unified or broken down into one single number, one score that you achieve by the sum of your actions or inactions. So basically, you are participating in a game all the time anyway. So you better know that, I think. Yeah.
Yes. And to change gears a bit, maybe we'll circle back to that, but there's something in the kind of using the aesthetic of the video game and using the kind of narrative drama of an organism, of like the idea of the human. I mean, I guess the question is sort of like, what is, especially in something like Factory of the Sun, I mean, like, to come back to this idea of contradiction, this idea between, like a fleshy body with, a metabolism. I mean, thinking about catalyzing, I mean, this idea of an organic metaphors as opposed to machine-driven metaphors of kind of processing and transmission. I guess the question is sort of, how do you think about the kind of status of, for example, you appear in both How Not to Be Seen and in Factory of the Sun, and I'm just curious to know about that self-reflexive moment of kind of placing yourself in your own work as a maker and also as a character.
Yeah, in Factory of the Sun, since the idea is the idea of a sort of labor camp where any sort of activity is well captured, the people who are appearing in the film is basically the film team. There's hardly anyone beyond the film team, no? I mean, two of the protagonists, I think. And basically, but it's been like that for a long time in my work, that, the team members always start to somehow weave into the story at a certain point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I know we might be opening up to questions in a little bit, but I had another brass tacks question, or this one's not so brass tacks, which is that the soundtrack, I mean, in both of the clips that we saw, I think is pretty remarkable. I think in Factory of the Sun, it really is one of the engines, like the way in which sound and music is used. And I'd be curious to know how you approach that and how you think about the role of sound in your work.
Yeah, it's vital. I mean, absolutely vital, and it takes a lot of time to sort of find and articulate that. One of the reasons is that usually there is such an array of confusing and very, very different sources of material which have almost nothing to do with one another, even though I pretend, they have. But the only reason why people are able to somehow pretend they go along with this fiction is because the music somehow provides a pretext for doing so. So it unifies, it creates the narrative, basically. Mm.
And could you say, I mean, just sort of like, I'm very curious about just like really specific decisions about how you describe a sound that you want to have, or?
It really depends, there is no, I very often think I really want to use a certain type of music or even song, and then I try and it doesn't work. So it really depends. It has to somehow have an affinity with the visuals. And I cannot really predict that.
Mm-hmm. And do you work with composers, or do you use found music?
Usually found music, but I've really started more and more to download samples and create some kind of tapestry of sounds, more or less.
So in a way, it's actually similar to, for example, the anime,
mm-hmm.
the anime scenes. It's this idea of using the internet as a kind of source of ready-made material.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But also I work a lot, with different musicians and...
Yeah. So I think we might open it up to questions. There is a mic. I just would like to remind you to please speak directly into the microphone for the recording. I see there's a question right here. Okay, great.
Hello, welcome. Thank you so much. Hi, I'm here. I was lucky enough that I was present at your talk in Cologne in the Pluriversale Festival last year, very recently, and I saw a very different kind of work, and I wanted to ask you about the process of production and post-production of the films. In that case, it seemed to be like something that was very doable with, like, you know, a piece of software that would allow you to edit. And in this case, it's something that involves a lot of like 3D animation and I guess a different kind of post-production. And I wanted to ask you about that, whether if that's something that you do differently, like with a team. Do you work on it on your own? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Just to explain to the audience, you know, the work you were referring to was basically a lecture which dealt with the question of machine sensing and the invisibility of most images. It was a work that centers around some observations I made during or observing some fighting on the Syrian side of the border. Okay, well, yes and no. Of course, this kind of work requires a larger team, but, you know, by any kind of standards, the teams are rather tiny always. So I think this was made. There was a phase where there were 6 people working on it, but this is by large the biggest team I ever had. So usually there's 2, 3 people working on it, on such kind of production. And works like the lectures, I just do it myself. There was a question.
Oh, I was also going to do this little unorthodox thing, which is I forgot to ask you a question. So may I ask a question? Which was that I wanted to ask you what you're working on next.
Yes, I'm working on a video with 2 parts. That started off when I asked myself the question, who is doing, you know, these 3D animations that I keep quoting from the web? Who is actually making these things? And I figured out that, in contrary to my expectations, I was assuming, you know, most 3D outsourcing to happen in India and the Philippines, but a lot of it is also happening in the Ukraine, and especially, you know, for European clients. And I went to interview the head of one such company, whose offices are in Kharkiv, which is a big city in eastern Ukraine. And they are working, of course, they are doing renderings for gated communities, all sorts of malls, luxury hotels, but also a lot of military simulations, right? So they are very good in modeling tanks and so on, which of course was very, not surprising, but remarkable given the fact that they were really living under the shadow of the looming invasion on the other side of the border. So that was interesting for me. How are the dreams of, you know, Western real estate being modeled in this kind of very tense situations?
Did you want to show the clip?
Maybe later, okay,
Later?
because
All
there's some questions still.
Hi, thank you. I feel privileged to be able to ask you a question right now because I love your work and your writing. I'm coming at it from a more philosophical side than I am an artistic side. In an essay that you wrote, I believe it's titled A Thing Like You and Me, there is a thread of wanting to sort of shirk representational frameworks in favor of what you call perhaps a participation type of way of interacting with images as things, and also shaking off subjectivity and perhaps as a product of some past trauma in the course of Western history, as you put it. I'm wondering to what extent this is still a through line in your work, in your current work, and in your own philosophical thinking. And secondly, regarding the topic of this, what is contemporary? This is an unrelated question. I'm wondering, is that problematic for you? Is is there something paradoxical in asking that question? Is that perhaps why that question is posed in this sort of symposium setting and in this artistic series? And in what way is it problematic or paradoxical? Because I know, of course, we want to know what contemporary is. We want to know what's happening now in order to be able to participate. But is it more paradoxical and problematic in a philosophical sense for you?
Well, thanks for this question. To respond to your first question, no, about things and the objects, the let's say line of inquiry I was following at that time was to try to analyze objects or commodities, you know, in a quite traditional sense, as these kind of condensed, congealed chunks of energy, really, no, of desire, of dream energy, if you like, in a surrealist sense. And I still think that there are links, for example, to this work, you know, people whose labor is dissolved into light, into energy, so that actually in most of my work you have this back and forth between matter and energy. I know that there is this parallel strand of thinking going on about objects which has a, let's say, kind of different orientation, which tries to describe objects from a more ontological point of view, but this was not what I was, interested in at that point, and haven't ever been. Second, what? Oh, the contemporary, yeah, of course. I mean, this is, contemporary is not contemporary, right? I mean, because there's so, the times are so fractured. Try to sync any kind of gadget with any other. It's impossible. I mean, maybe if they are from the same company, then it will work. This is the only possibility. You can sync anything with anything else. And the impossibility of syncing anything, you could also probably write it with TH, right? It would probably mean the same. Is one of the hallmarks of the contemporary, which is not contemporary. The times don't add up. They don't match. You know, people miss one another. They just text one another in order to miss one another, right? So it's this kind of time management of trying to miss another like constantly. And yeah, but it's true, no? Yeah. Yeah, I wrote another text about that, which is one of the chapters is called Junk Time. What is time when it's just broken and fractured and fragmented to pieces, and when schedules just don't match up anymore. So I think this is the temporality of the present. Yes. Oh, sorry, maybe there's someone else before. No. Yeah.
So maybe going off of talking about breaking time,
Yeah.
You're able to kind of congeal things with the video and working in film and kind of to create or work with contradictions really well. So I was kind of wondering if you ever think about actually working more in a meat space, like, or why are you, like, because you are really drawn to film and you're always kind of in that. But yeah, maybe.
Yeah. I wouldn't recommend to anyone putting me in a meat space. I'm gonna mess it up. Just keep me away from that. No. Yeah, it's basically probably good to recognize your limitations at a certain point, right? Well, I mean, of course, a lot of my work is actually talking. Or giving lectures or talking to people. So in that way, of course, you know, part of my work takes place with other people. But in the sense, I mean, video is always also a part of it, and I'm very happy for it, because then I don't have basically to, this work will stand in for what it's just talking on my behalf. I'm so happy, you know, for that. Yeah, you can just unload it on the video. Yes. And then there was a question back there, I think, or several. Okay, there was one here also. Yeah.
I have a question about kind of existing in this world that is highly represented in social media and surveilled in these many ways, if there's a kind of method of existing or functioning within it that actually subverts the kind of totalitarianism of the whole kind of world. And if that is possible within the visual arts as well, because of the visual arts relationship to the image and its attachment to that as well. And if you think that that's possible. Big.
I'm always so flattered that anyone thinks I could answer these questions. You're completely overestimating my ability to. But you know, I mean, of course, there's always a possibility. You know, otherwise there is no purpose. But you know, just to give you a very concrete example, the world is supposed to be surveilled 24/7 everywhere and so on. But you know, commercial airliners disappear into nothingness, and no one knows where they, you know, vanished. So of course, I mean, we tend to think that everything is being monitored, but there are, of course, vast stretches of the earth which are not only not monitored, but also not monitored on purpose, right? There are stretches, there's territories which are low resolution on Google Earth, and I really tried once, you know, what would it take to get a clear satellite image of a certain spot? And it's not possible, right? It's not possible. So, both the over-visibility and the complete under-visibility are part of the same system. This is why it's still possible, you know, to slip one from one end into the other, but it's not trivial.
Can you talk about the significance of dance in your work?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I look at it as like a sort of political sort of act of resistance. I read it that way, but I wanted to hear your take on why you embrace it. It's not just embrace, you put it in your work.
To be honest, I don't know. I mean, sure, I mean, I completely agree with your statement, but I'm not able to give you any sort of, you know, coherent answer to that. I'm always fascinated when people manage to communicate without talking. And I think that's one of the main instances of non-verbal human communication, right? And in this case, specifically because there's so many also technological levels and levels of variation, variation and dispersion involved. So, yeah, I think in this work, this was one of the most fascinating things, how even your own movements can be detached, no, from your body and sort of grafted onto other bodies. What does this mean? What if movements as such, now in a political sense, is this what happens? Is some kind of motion capture data extracted from a political movement and it then travels on, you know, on the waves of fantasy and desire onto another group of people? Is that what happens?
Hi. I just wanted to ask briefly, I was really moved by your 2007 film, Lovely Andrea, and I wanted to ask you a little bit, because also in this film I see that you have these characters that were killed in protest and kind of almost come back as these ghostly, sort of robotic voices, which I thought was really poetic and beautiful. I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about how grief plays out in your work, personally or politically, and then maybe also a little bit how like the role of the hero or the martyr fits into that. Thank you.
So, I mean, just to explain to the audience, Lovely Andrea and its predecessor November both revolve around a figure which is a sort of imaginary figure but based on a real person I used to know who was killed or rather extrajudicially executed as a Kurdish fighter about 20 years ago, 18 years ago. So both of these works are around basically around the images circulating of this person who was my childhood friend. So what does it mean if she is represented on a poster as a martyr? And how does this relate to the fact that we made all these Super 8 feminist martial arts films together? I think it's the main question, actually. Yes, and of course this figure continues to follow me throughout my work. There's also a reference to her in this work. One of these anime characters is basically named or, well, refers to this person. And there have been lots of, other figures coming in as a sort of, as a consequence of this constant ongoing inquiry into what happened, and actually this question became more and more irrelevant. It became rather a question that managed to catalyze a lot of other, inquiries. Yes, in a way also the latest work goes back to this case. So I think it's about not allowing grief, to just take hold of yourself, but just trying to transform it into lots of different other situations. I think the next question was here, actually. Was you? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for being here. My question is about film language, narrative, and discursivity. And in a way, my question comes from knowing what set of conceptual questions you're involved with, speculative, philosophical, conceptual questions, political questions, which all seem to be kind of beyond, like you're always pointing us to how the way the world is operating is beyond our kind of referential frame, right? There's more that we don't see than that we see. There's more information about us that we don't know than that we know. So it's kind of like the spatial imagination that we have fails, right? And the narrative imagination that we have as individuals fails. But in the work, both in the texts and in the videos, what I see is that you're relying very strongly on a kind of narrative, right? Both a visual narrative, right, and a narrative, right? And as you move in between a set of questions that fundamentally resist representation, narrativization, what do you feel like you can accomplish by the move into narrative, right? And what also do you feel kind of can't penetrate the barrier?
So to talk about something or to try to allude to something which is basically very difficult to grasp, right? Not even to represent. So still, if you want to talk about it, you need to find a way. So the narratives, I think, I'm not sure whether that's true or not, are really disjointed. This is why I say it's a mess, basically. They are hanging together by the, by something. But they do hang together. And this is precisely because I think that it's really important to try to suspend, because you cannot get rid of the disjointedness, of contemporary situations, of this kind of fragmentation, also these temporalities, broken down temporalities. There's got to be a way to bring these very different, conflicting and contradictory voices, materials, into one framework. I think that's really important. So this is how I try to do it. Yes, but you know, I mean, in the lecture the lady was referring to, there's just zero image whatsoever. So I mean, I use very different ways to talk about what's not there.
Thank you. I'm really interested in tension that I find between this way in which you're talking about your friend and also the figure of the superheroes that emerges in the game, but also being killed in the game and then returning as another being, an entity there. So that idea of the transcendental that appears there, and at the same time, this other way of looking at the world as disembodiment. Our best machines are made of sunshine, and then seeing the computer disseminate itself into the cosmos, into nothingness, right? So the opposite of the transcendental. And I'm interested in how there's a way in which one can read the work and connect it to all these different theoretical positions about death. And so I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean, this is a very strong thread also running through most of my work, even though it's probably not, people don't really notice, but the way in which things or different states of matter, I tried to frame them as stages, no? In the biography of things, but also people. People are existing in different states of matter. And this is really very much grounded in experiences with death, of course. But also in this work, there is a specific story that really went into creating this narrative. And in fact, this narrative is kind of the optimistic version of that. One person I know was very critically hurt during actually one of the protests that are quoted in the film. I mean, he barely survived, right? And after he was hit with a police baton on his head, was in a coma for a long time, and afterwards people started telling me that he became a completely different person, and he did. He was very, very, I mean, he's still very polite and the sweetest person, you know, but he's become completely fearless because he said, you know, I've been through almost everything, but I have nothing left to fear. So in that sense, I just extended that story by that little bit, right? That in fact something that could be considered as real trauma could also, and this is, you know, the classical superhero narrative. Someone gets almost killed, and then this becomes a sort of total conversion of that person who acquires these abilities, you know, superhero abilities in the process.
Thanks all for coming, and thank you to Lanka and Hito.
Thank you, Hito.